I'm Beth Hessel, the Executive Director. On your screen, you also see our one and only Tess Galen, our Coordinator of Events, who helps everything run so smoothly and make sure you can get on to the Zoom program and enjoy our amazing speakers. You also see our special guest tonight, Dr. Penniel Joseph, who I will introduce fully in just a moment. But at this time, I want to welcome you humbly to this place where we, with the goddess Athena, seek wisdom together. Since its founding in 1814, the Athenaeum has attended to the ways of its Greek namesake in looking to literature, history, the world, and one another for useful knowledge that enables us to be literate neighbors in our city and our world. As Dr. Joseph will lead us to think tonight about Dr. Martin Luther King and his concept of a beloved community where dignity and justice is offered to all, we as members, friends, and guests of the Athenaeum can meet one another tonight as a community that welcomes all to lifelong learning and engagement for flourishing for everybody. So welcome. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I wanted to point to you at the bottom of the screen. You will see the little Q&A icon. I invite you anytime during the talk, if you have questions, to type your questions there. And once Dr. Joseph is finished with his talk, I will moderate the Q&A time, and we hope to have a robust and lively conversation. You may also, at the upper right-hand corner, notice you can have a little icon that may say speaker view or gallery view. If you want to have your eyes only on Dr. Joseph, which would be better than looking at Tess and I while he speaks, I encourage you to click it so it says speaker view. Now tonight I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Penniel Joseph, who illuminates for us the lives of two of the towering leaders of the last century who called the United States to be a part of a global movement for justice, equality, and human dignity for all people. Dr. Joseph was raised in New York by a Haitian immigrant mother who instilled in him a deep respect in and interest in history and the civil rights movement, and introduced him to many of the leaders of the Black Power movement, of which he has become one of the leading scholars. He entered college at the age of 16, so you know he's smarter than almost any of us here. And he received his BA in history and Africana studies from SUNY Stony Brook, and a PhD in American history from our own Temple University. He has served on the faculty at Arizona State University, the University of Rhode Island, and Tufts University, where he founded their Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. Since 2015, he has been at the University of Texas at Austin as the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy there, where he serves as the Barbara Jordan Chair in Ethics and Political Values in the LBJ School of Public Affairs and as faculty in the History Department. Dr. Joseph is the author of numerous books that have all won awards and high acclaim, among them Waiting Till the Midnight Hour, a narrative history of Black power in America, Dark Days, Bright Nights, From Black Power to Barack Obama, and the most recent Stokely A Life about Stokely Carmichael. And tonight he is going to speak to us about his most recent book, The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. You can also follow him as he often appears on television news broadcasts, and also publishes regularly his commentary on issues of race, democracy, and civil rights in national newspapers. I invite you to join me warmly welcoming Dr. Joseph to our screen and the Athenaeum tonight. Welcome.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Tess, for facilitating all of this and for the invitation. I think I'm going to speak just for about 20 minutes, really maybe even less, so we can really have a conversation. I'll start off a little bit with why I wrote this book. Like Beth was saying, I am the proud son of Haitian immigrants who came to the United States in 1965. And I was really, you know what, can Beth and Tess, can you put your cameras off? Because I can kind of see, yeah. I've done so many of these, I know how, yes, thank you. I'm the proud son of Haitian immigrants who came to the United States in 1965. It was on my first picket line in elementary school. I've been in this space for decades. And my mother is my first historian, my first feminist, my first teacher about social justice. And so I've been in the space of anti-racism and social justice, including when I was a university graduate student at Temple University. And Black power has always been part and parcel of what I'm really interested in. And I was really interested in that because of being on picket lines, being in marches against police brutality in New York City, being in anti-racist struggles, and hearing certainly about the civil rights movement, but not really hearing good things about the Black power movement. And I'm the kind of person, if I'm hearing less about one thing than another, I want to investigate. And the deeper I got involved in the Black power movement and researching and studying the Black power movement, the more I was interested and fascinated. And so from that perspective, when we think about Malcolm and Martin, my interest in them grows out of my interest in the civil rights movement, the Black freedom struggle, but certainly the Black radical tradition. And that radical tradition is rooted in anti-slavery, radical abolitionism, including abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, who are interested in self-defense and were interested in political self-determination, and felt that if political violence was required to end racial slavery, that was actually morally and politically justified. But then other people who were revolutionaries who believed in nonviolence, like a Martin Luther King Jr., and even during the abolition movement, there were folks who were interested in nonviolence, and seeing where those movements diverge, but also where those movements converge. And so the work that I've done, which I've called Black Power Studies, has really been interdisciplinary. It's a whole field with numerous historians and scholars of the Black freedom struggle who've really done a deep dive into Black power, its connection with mass incarceration, prisoner rights movements, its connection with the rainbow radicalism of the 1960s and Chicano power and indigenous movements and Asian American movements, its impact in local struggles, including Black feminist struggles, welfare rights, tenants' rights, its impact on the Black studies movement, Black elected officials. So really in a panoramic way, it's local, national, regional, global impact. When we think about Black consciousness in South Africa, anti-colonial decolonization movements. I've written previous works on Stokely Carmichael, a narrative history of the Black Power movement, and a book on Barack Obama, and edited some anthologies as well. And in a way that all led me to The Sword and the Shield. And when we think about The Sword and the Shield, that title is really a provocation. We usually think of Malcolm X as the political sword of this period, and we think of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as the shield of this period. And I make an argument in The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., that we have really been framing them the wrong way. We've been looking at them the wrong way. We say that it's King's dream versus Malcolm's nightmare. And what we have are two revolutionary figures who actually are much more convergent than divergent. I make an argument that Malcolm X is Black America's prosecuting attorney who's arguing for radical Black dignity, and I want to break that down. And what I mean by Malcolm being a prosecuting attorney is that in contrast to King, Malcolm X is not trying to defend Black humanity to white folks. He does not care what white people thinks about Black people. He takes Black humanity as a given. What he's doing is prosecuting white America for a series of crimes against Black humanity that date back to racial slavery. So it's Malcolm X who is really articulating his own 1619 project about 4 centuries of racial oppression, of economic exploitation, of anti-Black racism, and the punishment, incarceration, demonization, and dehumanization of Black bodies. That's what Malcolm is doing. At the same time, to Black audiences, Malcolm is arguing that Black liberation actually resides in the last place they would ever care to look, in their own history, traditions, their own value system. So when you think about Malcolm, sometimes people ask me, well, what was Malcolm X's biggest policy transformation? Well, Malcolm's biggest policy transformation was turning Negroes into Black people and African people. and I'll repeat that. Malcolm X's biggest policy transformation is turning Negroes into Black people, into people who are pro-Black, pro-Africa, because Malcolm visits Africa and the Middle East as early as 1959. Malcolm's arguing for what I call radical Black dignity. What does he mean by that? Well, Malcolm means the end of systemic racism and white supremacy, but he also means a lot more. For Malcolm, radical Black dignity is Black people having political, intellectual, cultural, and economic self-determination in the United States and globally. Malcolm is a Pan-Africanist, he's a radical Black nationalist, he's a Black internationalist, and he's a believer in a global Islamic political revolution that's undergirded by human rights and justice for all people. Malcolm believes that Black people will only get dignity through the defeat of what he calls world white supremacy. So for Malcolm, he's interested in defeating white supremacy, and yes, white people who are in allegiance to this socially, politically constructed concept of white supremacy, economically constructed as well. So when we think about Malcolm and this idea of radical Black dignity, it's very important conceptually so we can see and follow his evolution politically, intellectually, over the course of his public career from 1952 to 1965. Now, Dr. King, of course, there's contrast. Dr. King is arguing for radical Black citizenship. I argue that Dr. King really serves as Black America's defense attorney. He's defending both sides of the color line. He defends white people to Black people, and he really defends Black lives to white people, and he defends white souls to Black people. So King makes an argument that anti-Black racism and white supremacy has distorted American democracy, but disfigured the soul of white Americans because the privilege that they utilize is predicated on the dehumanization of other people at their own expense. So everybody's being hurt by this idea of racial segregation, this political reality of anti-Black racism and white supremacy. Dr. King is talking about radical Black citizenship. King is a bigger believer, at least initially, in democratic institutions than Malcolm X. So what does King mean by radical Black citizenship? Well, King is defining citizenship as more than just the right to vote. King argues that citizenship encompasses a guaranteed income. So yes, before Andy Yang talked about a UBI, a universal basic income, we had an activist called Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who called the world, what he called the World House, and certainly the United States. He organized a movement to occupy Washington, D.C., Poor People's Campaign of 1967-68, breaks with Lyndon Johnson, and he calls for a universal basic income, guaranteed jobs, housing affordability, decent housing fit for human beings. He calls for food justice, health care, and the desegregation of all public schools and all residential neighborhoods. That's what he means by citizenship. So what I argue in The Sword and the Shield is if we follow the evidence in the way in which the book unfolds, after standalone biographical chapters, they're really interwoven the rest of the way. What we see is that over time, even as they have disputes, Malcolm is definitely unleashing ad hominem attacks against King at times, calling him an Uncle Tom and worse. He asks for forgiveness in 1964. They come to converge and understand that the Black freedom struggle requires radical Black dignity and citizenship. And so I'll say that again. They come to converge and argue that the Black freedom struggle requires dignity and citizenship. With the time left, I want to discuss what happens with the convergence. What are some examples? Well, first, the only time they meet is March 26, 1964 at the US Senate when the Senate is debating the 1964 Civil Rights Act. They both come and organize press conferences at the US Senate building in support of the Civil Rights Act. Right before going to the US Senate, Malcolm is working on the ballot or the bullet speech, where he's making an argument that the ballot is Black freedom and he's supportive of voting rights. But if the ballot is not given, there's going to be violence. And this idea of the ballot or the bullet is really important because it's actually a very hopeful speech by Malcolm X. And he's not trusting in elected officials, he's actually trusting in the Black community. And that's very, very important. But he tells Robert Penn Warren in an interview for Who Speaks for the Negro, which comes out the following year, that him and Dr. King share the same goals. Penn Warren is taken aback and he said, "What is that?" Malcolm says it's human dignity. They have different tactics, but they share the same goal of human dignity. In 1964, Malcolm takes the 5-week Hajj, the pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca, becomes an Orthodox Muslim. He says he starts to see that there are sincere white people and they can be part of the struggle as well. On December 17th, 1964, Malcolm is sitting next to Andy Young at the 369th Armory in Harlem. 8,500 people are there. And he actually listens to MLK give a speech in the aftermath of King winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. And of course, on February 3rd and February 4th, he's in 1965, he's in Tuskegee and then Selma, Alabama. He goes to Selma to visit Dr. King. Dr. King's in jail, and he ends up giving a speech alongside of Andy Young and Coretta Scott King. And Malcolm X tells Coretta Scott King that he admires her husband. He's there to help her husband and to let the people see that there's an alternative if voting rights aren't given, that there's going to be an alternative. And that's why he says to the press afterward that what Dr. King is fighting for is right. He's fighting for the ballot. And if the ballot isn't given, it's going to be gotten one way or the other. So Malcolm X, we could see some of the influence there before his assassination in New York City on February 21st, 1965. In the case of Dr. King, we really see the influence much more after Malcolm X's assassination. In a way, the influence begins as early as 63 in Birmingham. And there's a chapter in The Sword and the Shield called Birmingham's Radicals, which really looks at the impact of Birmingham on King and Malcolm X. Malcolm is in Washington, D.C. in 63 as temporary head of Muslim Mosque number 4, in addition to the Muslim Mosque number 7, Temple number 7, which he leads in New York City. And he's calling Dr. King cowardly for leading defenseless women and children against basically police violence in Birmingham. So the police are unleashing German shepherds and fire hoses that are powerful enough to take the bark off of trees. But he pushes back. Dr. King pushes back against Malcolm. He says to Malcolm in Los Angeles in May, before 35,000 people, that nonviolence is not the weapon of the weak, it's the weapon of the strong. And some people aren't strong enough to embrace the discipline of nonviolence, and it's the only way our movement and struggle can win. Where they're gonna converge that year is they're both gonna be publicly excoriating the police violence and the police brutality that we see in 1963. A lot of times when people think about this year, 2020, of racial and political reckoning, we keep thinking of 68 when we're better off thinking of 63, because 63 is much more closer to the positive civil rights marches that we were seeing all throughout 63 than necessarily 1968. So this year, on some levels, maybe the police repression resembles 68 more, but the positive demonstrations for Black life are much more reminiscent of 63, not just the March on Washington, but the June 23rd, 1963 Freedom Walk in Detroit that King keynotes. 125,000 people are there. That's the largest civil rights demonstration up until the March on Washington. When we think about King and Malcolm in 63 as well, they are excoriating police violence. King is also talking about reparations in the March on Washington, the I Have a Dream speech. He says, "We come here to cash a check that has been stamped insufficient funds, but we refuse to believe that the great vaults of opportunity in America are bankrupt." He starts off that speech by saying, now is the time to make real the promise of democracy. Malcolm calls the March on Washington a farce on Washington because he says it's a stage managed affair by the Kennedy administration. And he says that Black people should have paralyzed the city of Washington, D.C. King is going to agree with him by 1965. In the aftermath of the Voting Rights Act in Selma and the explosion of in Watts, Los Angeles, August 11th to August 18th, 1965, Dr. King's going to write an essay, Beyond the Los Angeles Riots, really political urban rebellions, where he says that he's going to use nonviolence as a political sword. These are King's words, to paralyze cities, to eradicate poverty, eradicate segregation, to break the back of white supremacy. He tries to do so in Chicago and is defeated by the racism of Mayor Daley, but also the fact that you have Black folks who are eager participants of the Democratic political machine. These are Black folks who are part of Mayor Daley's political plantation unapologetically to get resources at times for themselves, at times for their communities, and can't imagine another way out. By 1966, King is marching arm in arm with Stokely Carmichael in Mississippi as the Black Power revolution is unleashed. King is a critic of Black Power, but he is also an interlocutor with Black Power activists, most famously Stokely Carmichael. He criticizes any aspects of narrow nationalism. He criticizes any notion of violence, but he doesn't criticize the movement's structural critique of racism and imperialism and white supremacy. By 1967, King comes out against the Vietnam War and really announces himself as a political revolutionary. And in a lot of ways, he embraces aspects of Malcolm X's Black nationalist rhetoric of Black pride and dignity and self-determination. Malcolm had come out against the Vietnam War in 1964. King comes out against the Vietnam War April 4th, 1967 at the Riverside Church in New York City. At that speech, King says that the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. He says that militarism, materialism, racism are the triple evils facing humanity. He pushes back against people who accuse him of disloyalty or a lack of patriotism by saying that he was celebrated when he said for Black people to be nonviolent in Selma and in Mississippi and Chicago, but when he tells the United States to be nonviolent in Vietnam and to stop napalming villages with women and children, he's called disloyal. So this is a really great speech by King, and it really announces something different in King. King comes to see the United States in a very similar vision that Malcolm had. Malcolm famously quips that you can't put a knife in a person's back 9 inches and take it out 6 inches and call that progress. And so Malcolm is belittling the notion of racial progress. He says, you haven't taken the knife out, you haven't even acknowledged that there's a wound there. By 1967, King is really walking around the United States like a man on fire. He's delving into the prophetic social gospel tradition. He really is a truth teller, speaking truth to power. But he also starts to talk about Black pride and dignity. He says in one speech that it's racist to talk about little white lies being better than Black lies, right? I mean, he's a man on fire. And what's so interesting about King is repudiating white supremacy in the bold strokes that Malcolm X had done. Malcolm X is our boldest critic of white supremacy of the 20th century, the entire century. And really King, in the aftermath from 65 to 68, starts walking down that Jericho road as well. And King in 67 says that the halls of Congress are running wild with racism. In September of 67, before the American Psychological Association, King says that the biggest problem in the United States is white racism and white Americans whose racism is producing chaos, and that they are lying and saying that there would be racial progress, but for the chaos that they're producing. This is Martin Luther King Jr. This is not Malcolm X, right? And I'll end on a couple of anecdotes. One of the ways they converge is that they both were obsessed with racial slavery and the way racial slavery had disfigured and distorted American democracy, the lies the country told itself about Reconstruction, the lies the country told itself about the 20th century, and efforts to achieve democracy by ignoring the suffering of Black people and really participating in a kind of historical amnesia and not talking about the racial pogroms, the massacres against Black folks during Reconstruction and after. And he's speaking in Marks, Mississippi in early 1968, the poorest zip code in the United States. And what King says to the folks in Marks, Mississippi, and King is in tears when he listens to folks telling him, poor Black people, that they can't find food, their children go without shoes. He's in tears. Andy Young is there, Ralph Abernathy, his lieutenants are really surprised that he's crying because he has seen this kind of poverty before, but something's really moving him here. And what King tells the folks in Marks, Mississippi, and we have the film to see this, the video, the evidence, the documentary evidence, he tells them that the way they're living in Marks, Mississippi is a crime, right? Same language as Malcolm X, and that they're gonna come and they're really gonna occupy Washington. The Poor People's March is the first Occupy movement. Of course, Dr. King's assassinated before Resurrection City is erected, but we shouldn't hold that against him. When we think about what King tells folks in 1968, he says that it's a crime for Black people to be living like this in the richest nation in the world. But he also adds a history lesson. He says that the same racists who are telling you to pull yourselves up by the bootstraps, and remember, these racists can be Democrats or Republicans. He understands that, it's bipartisan. He says these same racists ignore the fact that after the Civil War, white immigrants and white folks got millions of acres of free land through the Homestead Act, and Black people never got 40 acres and a mule. And he says these people, and again, King is very, very frank and blunt in his language by the late 60s. He accuses white America of being morally reprehensible and politically indefensible. And he says, these are the same people telling you to pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. So King, by the last several years of his career, he sees the searing racial wilderness that Malcolm X had always documented, because one thing I didn't say is about their backgrounds. Malcolm had served 76 months in jails. Malcolm's father had been killed at a very young age, 6 years old, and the family believed it was by white supremacists. Malcolm's mother was put in a psychiatric institution for most of his adult life. Malcolm had experienced racial trauma in a way that Martin Luther King Jr. did not, who went to Morehouse at 15, who was mentored by Benjamin Mays, knew Howard Thurman, who knew all these titans of the Black social gospel. So King comes with an intrinsic belief in democracy, even as he has critiques of it, that pales in comparison to Malcolm's utter skepticism. Malcolm says American democracy is nothing but American hypocrisy. He says that American democracy is something Black people have not had, don't have now, and never will have. So Malcolm is very, very sure of this, and he maintains that stance. What's so extraordinary when we think about the sword and the shield and how we frame both of these political revolutionaries is that King comes closer to Malcolm's view than the other way around, right? So I think that what we've done is misread them, we've mischaracterized them, we've misframed them. And when we do that, we really make them less effective for our contemporary times, because I think that these are the two most important leaders for the times we face right now because of the intersectionality of the issues they talk about. What's so extraordinary about this current moment with Black Lives Matter is fusing that with intersectional identity and the long Black feminist tradition of looking at race, class, gender, sexuality, and arguing that Black women's struggles and Black radical feminist struggles can be universal if we look at the particular, we get to the universal by looking at the particular experiences of radical Black women. And I think the BLM movement has been extraordinary in that sense, and activists like Tamika Mallory and Patrisse Cullors and Alicia Garza and No Name and others have been really great and amplified the work of Malcolm and Martin by really making these progressive interventions in terms of how do we define leadership, Who are we going to center within the Black community? Decentering Black cisgender heteronormative leadership, but the issues that Martin and Malcolm talked about are remain resonant. You know, they talked of critiqued predatory capitalism or racial capitalism. They critiqued U.S. imperialism and neoliberalism. They critiqued the exploitation that is at the root of white supremacy. They critique the caste system. Isabel Wilkerson talks about caste. They critique the racial caste system. And Malcolm, more than anybody, knew that racial caste system, even as Native peoples and Asian and Latinx people are going to be abused in this country, the organizing principle of America's racial caste system is anti-Black racism and anti-Blackness. And Malcolm understood that. You know, King comes around to understanding that. And when we think about this idea of the sword and the shield, over time, they both utilize a political sword and shield to try to lead a human rights movement that's talking about universal principles, but it's going to get that universality by looking at the particular struggles of Black people, both in the United States and global. And I'll stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph. This is fascinating, and I'm hoping that people are, if they have not, they're ordering your book to read it, because it is a wonderful read. You do such a fantastic job of really, as you said, kind of breaking down these stereotypes of who Malcolm was and who King was, that have sort of divided. You can only be for King or for Malcolm. And you can't appreciate both, and you've done a great job in this work. So I'm getting questions coming in and encouraging all of you to add your questions, the Q&A, the chat. I'll keep looking at both of them. And I know Dr. Joseph is excited to engage with us. So our first question we have was, how did Malcolm X's Hajj change his thinking? Oh, and you're muted.
Sorry about that. I think it amplifies this thinking. I think one of the mistakes we make is this idea that there's this pre-Malcolm. We separate Malcolm from 1952 to 1964, or 1950 when he joins the Nation of Islam, 49, 50 in prison up until 1964. And I think that Alex Haley's autobiography does this mistakenly. Doesn't mean that he doesn't evolve, but a lot of who we see the last year is who he always was. Certainly there were constraints in the Nation of Islam, but he knew about white Muslims when he went to the Middle East in 1959. He was talking about human rights, and he has a long ongoing critique of democracy and imperialism when we see his speeches in the 1950s and the early 60s. So I think what gets amplified after the Hajj is this idea that he can be both a secular leader, but he can be an Islamic faith leader who's pushing for human rights. And he wants to make deeper connections he had always made. Remember, Malcolm meets up with Fidel Castro in Harlem in 1960. Malcolm has access to an office at the United Nations because of his diplomatic ties. It's Malcolm who introduces Cassius Clay before he's Muhammad Ali to diplomats. We've got a new movie, Regina King, One Night in Miami, which looks at Malcolm X, Cassius Clay, Sam Cooke, and James Brown, the night after Cassius Clay upset Sonny Liston at 22 years old to be the youngest heavyweight champion in history. And what Malcolm is doing is trying to mentor Cassius Clay, right? So when we think about Malcolm, that last year, it's an amplification of who he was. Certainly he leaves certain things behind, the cult of personality around Elijah Muhammad. Some of the hyper-masculinity and the toxic masculinity and the real embrace of patriarchy that is reflected in the Nation of Islam and other organizations too. We are a patriarchal society. We are a heteronormative society. We all, Black people are part of these structures too. And it impacts, even as Black people have had parallel institutions, they're not outside of history, right? So Malcolm starts to leave those things behind. There's a great interview with him where he says, when it comes to women, the biggest eye-opener when he visited Africa was seeing African revolutionaries who looked upon African women as co-leaders of that revolution. And he says that by that point, and Malcolm had said a ton of sexist stuff with the Nation of Islam, a ton of crazy stuff. He says, I'm seeing that the most progressive countries view women as equals, right? So he's learning, and King would have had to learn along that line too, because they both are within these a super patriarchal, sexist, deeply misogynistic society. And then in organizations, the Black church, unbelievably patriarchal still, unbelievably sexist still, unbelievably homophobic still, right? And the Nation of Islam, all those things. So these are folks, what was gonna save them eventually is their own intellectual curiosity, right? Because you can't stay in any of these kind of regressive organizations without turning your brain off, right? Because if you keep your brain on, you're going to know that being afraid or hateful towards queer folks or trans folks or people of a different religion or color, you're going to say, this doesn't make any sense. This doesn't make any sense. So what happened with them is over time, they're always evolving because they're intellectually curious. So that last year, yes, people sometimes want to just embrace the last year, but I'm saying it's a piece of who he always was.
Thank you. Now we'll have a question that jumps over to King. You mentioned briefly King's social gospel influences, and there's a question wondering, how did this tradition fuel King's development post-1965?
Oh, big time. I think that King always knew he was going to have to confront that Black social gospel tradition, and he tries to do it incrementally. And when we think about the Black social gospel, this is an idea where certainly there's a social gospel tradition where when we think about religious teachings, when we think about the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, we here on earth are going to interpret that as a social justice philosophy. So we do our good works here, and yes, when we get to heaven, but right here is a site of contestation. And the Black social gospel really interprets Jesus, interprets the prophets as anti-racists, as people who are trying to defeat injustice whenever they see it, right? And you can have a Black social gospel where Jesus is not blonde and blue-eyed, he's from the Middle East, he's brown and brown-eyed, okay? And so that, what you see in 65, 66, 67, 68 can absolutely be interpreted, in addition to the influence of the Black Power movement and other movements, as King really being entrenched in the social gospel. And you hear it in the last speech where he says, I may not get there with you, and we've got some difficult days ahead. And he says, it doesn't matter for me, and I'm not worried about anything, and I'm not fearing any man. And I've seen the promised land. I mean, he's really doing this obviously ecstatic rhetorical flight of fancy with soaring rhetoric, but that's really deeply rooted in the social gospel tradition of bearing that cross, of having your shield. But also, when we think about Jesus and the moneylenders, say, I came to bring the sword as well as the shield. And that's what King comes to embrace, where it's not always going to be Nobel Prize and Time Magazine Man of the Year and photo ops with the president, right? So if you embrace that social gospel prophetic tradition, if there's injustice anywhere, by virtue of your faith, you're actually going to be on the margins. And that's what happened to the King. So he goes from the center to the margins, but he's satisfied because he's following his faith. And certainly that faith is a social gospel, Black social gospel interpretation of how do we defeat white supremacy? How do we achieve a different country?
Another one, do you think that King's philosophical movement toward increasing radicalism helped contribute to his assassination?
Oh, certainly. Yeah, absolutely. I think that King starts to call out structures and systems of racism and inequality and economic injustice that will cost the nation a lot to try to transform. He looks for redistributive justice. King, you know, we talk about defund the police now, reimagine public safety. King is thinking even bigger about the US military and the US military budget. And what are our priorities? How do we walk the talk? What is our morality? And not the cheap morality of who's sleeping with who, but the morality of do people's lives actually matter? How do we treat those who are poor and marginalized and non-able-bodied? How do we treat the elderly? How do we treat the young? That's what he's concerned with, right? Why do we drop bombs on nations in the name of democracy or freedom? Like, you know, and King is just asking all of us, not even does this make sense? He's saying as a man of faith that this doesn't make sense. I mean, one of his last speeches, March 31st, 1968, is the Passion Sunday speech before the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., and 3,000 folks are there. And King is making this passionate moral case for ending poverty and ending war in the United States, and saying that people who are of faith should be part of that crusade, right? That they shouldn't be thinking to themselves that they somehow stand separate and siloed away from the acts that this nation commits. And so I think he's an extraordinary figure in that way. But certainly by the time he's organizing a Poor People's Campaign, and remember that campaign is including whites in Appalachia and the Ozarks, it's including Mexican Americans, indigenous folks, Native Americans, including poor Black folks. And he's saying we're going to stay in Resurrection City. And they plan to protest at the Department of Agriculture. They plan to protest at the Department of Commerce. They plan to go to all these places, which Resurrection City did, but without King. And he gets not even sidetracked. He envelops a sanitation strike in Memphis, Tennessee, as part of this movement. There's 1,100 sanitation workers who are on strike for a living wage in Memphis, Tennessee. And these are folks who are cleaning up maggots and cleaning up people's filthy garbage who no one wants to see. They're all Black, right? And he's fighting for a living wage. And that's when he's assassinated April 4th, Thursday, 6 p.m. Memphis time, 1968. So it's important for us to definitely link the kind of rooted transformational politics he was after and the assassination, definitely. And again, the assassination, his anti-war criticism, the criticism against capitalist exploitation and economic injustice, he's braiding together a very, very powerful criticism. And he's also braiding together a very powerful peace movement too, that's gonna have all kinds of consequences before his assassination.
You mentioned in the book that a decent number of times Malcolm X invites King to come and participate in something or attend something or come and meet him. And King never takes him up on that. What is your understanding of why King does not meet Malcolm before the 1964 meeting?
Yeah, and even that's an accident.
Yeah.
You know, he's got too much to lose as this political mobilizer before the passage of the Voting Rights Act. I think in a lot of ways, the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the subsequent rebellion in Los Angeles really frees King and unburdens him. So there's too much to lose. In a lot of ways, we could think of King before the passage of the August 6, 1965, not only as this defense attorney, like I've argued, and I say Malcolm is Black America's prosecuting attorney, he becomes a statesman, but King becomes this really unelected figure, president of Black America in a way, who is a co-statesman alongside of Lyndon Johnson and Jack Kennedy. And so there's strictures there, like the president can't meet with everybody, right? You know, because how does it look, especially in that historical time? Obviously, we're in very, very strange times now, but most of the time the president can't meet with everybody. And so when we think about King meeting with Malcolm, King, before Malcolm's death, has too much to lose. What really liberates King is him seeing and understanding that even after the Voting Rights Act is passed and the Civil Rights Act is passed, there are these systems of marginalization and brutality that are entrenched everywhere. And so he starts to say, well, I actually have to think bigger, but I'm also going to think bolder, right? And that means a lot of the alliances that you had made with different communities, with different faith communities, with different political actors, they're going to be frayed and they're going to disappear, because now you're actually wanting to achieve something bigger than reform. So I think that if Malcolm X had not been assassinated, absolutely they would have met and found some common ground as the 60s progressed. But while Malcolm is still alive, King is in his own straitjacket. Malcolm very famously says, he felt like he was in a mental straitjacket. Now, before, while he was in the NOI, when he's disputing with them once he leaves, King is in a straitjacket too. Because think about it, the king who goes to Chicago in '66 and is dialoguing with gang leaders and defending gang leaders, he wasn't doing that in '63 and '64. So even by '66. The king who's walking with Stokely Carmichael in Memphis, in Mississippi, during the Black Power marches, that's a liberated king too. That's a king who's not answering telegrams from the president of the United States, and who's openly critical of the shortcomings of the Great Society. So he becomes a different person because he has to be. He has to be. I mean, there's another version of King that sort of becomes an establishment figure post 65. And certainly I don't think that person would have been assassinated. Yes.
Sorry, I didn't, my unmute button didn't want to unmute. So we're getting a number of folks saying, wow, I mean, they're just, this reverberates to the present, and as an amazing historian, you are able to, without directly going there, to bring us to those links and connections. But I think there's some desire here to maybe flesh that out a little bit more. Curious what someone wants to know, if you see differences between our time and the 1960s, because it all sounds quite similar.
Yeah, I think there's differences in the sense that in the 1960s, the head from at least 61 to 69, the presidents Kennedy and Johnson are going to be more receptive to the kind of movements for racial justice that we've seen erupt this year. So that's a little different. But what's very similar, and certainly this year, another thing that's unprecedented is just the numbers, right? Like, over 5,000 cities, over 20 million people. We haven't seen those numbers. But 63 is similar in this sense. When John Kennedy on June 11, 63, gives his racial justice speech, and he says that, civil rights should be central to American democracy. He's saying that at the midway point of where there's, almost 800, a 10-week period where there's 800 civil rights demonstrations, 15,000 people are arrested, and demonstrations are making national news. And again, they're going to be in places like Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where you're at right now. They're going to be in Greenwood, Mississippi, Greenville, Mississippi as well. It's going to be, of course, Birmingham, Alabama, and other places. So Kennedy even says in that speech that, and his words, quote, are that there's a revolution that's occurring. And he says it can be violent or peaceful. He says those who do nothing invite shame as well as violence, and those who act boldly recognize right as well as reality. And that's President Kennedy. That's really Kennedy's finest moment as president. I always push back against people who talk about moonshots because, like, traveling to the moon and stuff, like Gil Scott-Heron says, in terms of, Whitey on the moon and Black people are dying. So there's no way, the moon stuff can be your greatest legacy if there's human beings to be saved, right? So it can't be science and technology. So I think Kennedy's finest moment is June 11, 63. Medgar Evers is assassinated around 1 a.m. Mississippi time in Jackson, Mississippi, a few hours after that speech. I think that the kind of violence that we're seeing this year, we've not seen on this scale. Let's say we have seen violence even bigger than this in 68. This is not the kind of violence we saw in 68, but we're seeing state-sanctioned violence that's very similar to at least 63, right? And some people would say closer to 68. So those are similarities. But I would say one of the differences, which is a positive difference, is we're seeing much more white involvement in civil rights struggles, in struggles for Black dignity, Black citizenship now. Even as the polling for BLM has gone down, but the people who are active have continued, whether it's Portland or just other cities. And really the fact that you have Breonna Taylor and George Floyd as these iconic individuals who are not MLK, who are not Malcolm X. It's tragic, but there's a progress in that too.
So as people look at how to make a difference, there's one question. Can you say something about how teachers of history and others who care about history can resist Trump's move to impose a, quote, patriotic history curriculum? And can you set this issue in context of the Black Power history you do so well, or would we be better off ignoring Trump's provocations?
You know, I'd say the biggest thing everybody can do is vote, right? Is to vote and help organize people to vote, help them to register to vote, contribute to candidates that you feel are candidates of conscience, you know, so those are big things. But yeah, I would say to ignore that provocation. I'd say do a deep dive and see how the 1619 Project, Nicole Hannah-Jones's Pulitzer Prize winning project can really help you. It's funny, I had a conversation with Eddie Glaude, who you all are gonna have very, very soon, maybe even next week. And he was talking about how, you know, he found the 1619 Project too patriotic. Like he loves aspects of it, but it's too. And so even that 1619 Project is certainly actually not this anti-American project. Where it is subversive is that it looks at 1619 to the present, including 1776 to the present, and it just lays out an argument of the way in which racial slavery helps to, one, produce global capitalism and American capitalism. Two, when we think about racial slavery, it creates two supply chains, one of power and privilege that emanates towards whites, and not just the white wealthy because of caste, just white people, period, and one of misery and grief that emanates towards Black people because of caste, right? And so that project just wants us to admit that, hey, racial slavery is connected to universities, railroads, private insurance companies, a whole ecosystem that made the United States the most powerful country in that day, really, and in our own, right? And then what does this mean, right? What does it mean, and how is racial slavery connected to healthcare, connected to mass incarceration, residential and public school segregation, wealth inequality, unemployment, all these different things. And so I think that for those of us who are interested in history and teaching that history in a way that produces critical thinking, those are all parts of the story to explain to people. People can also look, while looking at that story, the triumphs of that history too, right? You can look at the people who did in their own ways either survive, overcome, at times flourish, but you can look at the people who didn't, right? The people who didn't. So I think that the 1619 Project is very, very important. And one of the things I argue here is that Malcolm and Martin, they really engaged in their own rhetorical version. They were very much interested in the history of racial slavery, Reconstruction, Homestead Acts, the Industrial Revolution, migration. And you can see in speeches that they're talking about it. They're both students of history, but they're also delivering a seminar. And in the 1960s, they're trying to push us all towards this reckoning, right? And I think, you know, obviously 2020, we're experiencing the reckoning. You know, Baldwin is a part of this, so is Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, where she says, "Is this America?" And really the answer to Fannie Lou Hamer, where she says, "Is this America, the land of the free, the home of brave, where we're beaten for wanting to live like human beings?" The answer is an emphatic yes, it is, but can it be different? And that's what Malcolm and Martin, and I think even this time, is trying to do. The answer is not a return and say, well, in the 1950s, Eisenhower America, my family lived very nicely and stuff. Most families did not, who were families of color, right? Women didn't have it great in 1950, 55. Black women, even worse, right? So it's actually, we're called upon to try and build a new consensus, right? A new consensus that is unbelievably expansive, more expansive than we've ever considered, right? Because have we really ever considered women? Have we considered Black people? Have we considered farm workers? Have we considered the indigent, the homeless, and say, we are gonna exalt them in this democracy? No, we have not. We know we haven't, right? And so the chickens are coming home to roost, like Malcolm said, this entire year. Malcolm said that in the aftermath of Kennedy's assassination, people erroneously thought he was celebrating that. He wasn't saying that. He was saying the kind of violence that the United States deploys domestically and internationally had boomeranged in on itself. And he was saying that why would anybody be surprised at this? In 2020, and even what we're seeing, presidential clash, you don't want to call it debate, these national global humiliations that we're seeing on a day-to-day, Supreme Court, RBG's death, our institutions are failing, but this has been a long time coming, and race is at the center of this. Race is at the core of this. This is not marginal. When somebody uses the word suburbs as a dog whistle, we know what the person's saying, even though it's ridiculous because there's Black people in the suburbs too, right? There's, you know, I'm not saying there's no segregation, but they're acting like, he's acting like there's never been a Black person in a suburb. Has anybody heard of Prince George's County, Maryland? Anybody? You know, so the suburbs, when people say they're going to overrun your suburbs there, we know what they're saying. And those are dog whistles that goes back to 68 and Nixon. But truthfully, what Malcolm and Martin, and when King talks about building a beloved community, he says it's going to be a place that is free of economic injustice, free of racism and segregation, free of violence and free of materialism. And those are the big things that are still plaguing us right now. Those are, because all the other things we can actually get to under those rubrics in terms of racism, violence, materialism, and economic injustice. All those things are and that's why I think these figures are so important, because it resonates and reverberates in our own time.
So this is, I think this, you got a lot of this question, but you might have a little more that you want to say. Given the recent willingness of white people to actually listen and learn from Black people, and how often Dr. MLK Jr.'s words are cherry-picked to fit a certain narrative that makes white people feel comfortable. I think I'll add that in there. I think that's what they meant. How can the convergence of his worldview with Malcolm's, illustrated beautifully in your book, be used to better inform the public and possibly illuminate potential blind spots and change hearts and minds to progress towards radical dignity and citizenship in 2020?
Yeah, I think, you know, right now we have a generational opportunity in front of us, right? And I think what the way in which those words can be utilized is to talk about shared sacrifice. Because I think at times Malcolm criticized King because he thought King's notion of a beloved community was going to be one-sided. I think when you interrogate King deeper, he was talking about shared sacrifice by Blacks, whites, everybody in between, right? And people were going to have to sacrifice all kinds of privilege, racial privilege, economic privilege, gender privilege, the whole works, right? You know, meaning you have to, yes, pay more taxes. I tell everybody, yes. When you build a beloved community, like in the city of Austin, they have all these things that say, and I'm a homeowner, we want to do all this stuff and it's going to raise your taxes. You know what I do on every ballot? Yes, okay? Because it costs. So if that's an extra $500, if it's an extra $5,000, you have to say yes. You're going to find the money to do more good in the world. So the way in which I think King and this idea of radical citizenship and dignity is the fact that you can be a revolutionary who's nonviolent, but also that Malcolm's provocation to all of us to turn the civil rights movement into a human rights movement, but also challenging us for those people who kept saying they didn't want to hear about him talking about self-defense. Malcolm challenged the nation to stop being violent towards Black people, saying, no, you don't have to, no one's going to ever talk about self-defense if you're peaceful and respectful of them too, right? So both of them, this idea of radical dignity and citizenship, I think we've been seeing it in the streets. We've seen most of the protests have been actually nonviolent and peaceful. BLM does not advocate violence. They've been using King's nonviolent civil disobedience, but they've also been following Malcolm X's dictum in terms of systems and structures and this idea of systemic racism and defeating white supremacy. And I think what white people who are interested in being in this space can do is really listen, be attentive, leverage your personal and professional networks and that supply chain of power and privilege that in a very specific way you have access to on behalf of amplifying Black voices and voices of color, female voices, women voices, feminist voices of color right there in Philadelphia or wherever you live. So there's ways to do it. And even people who live in neighborhoods, there's zoning and there's housing affordability and codes that you can be a part of that are both connected to city council, but also connected to just neighborhood associations, right? If a school is all white, why is that? If there are no people of color, there's no Black people here. Why is that, right? So there's things that we can all do in our workplace. I lived in Philly for 5 years, so I know about the good and the bad and the shortcomings of Philadelphia when it comes to racial justice. And Philly, like every city, has a hard history. But I do think that this is a moment of great hope if we work and build that beloved community and we really try to achieve something different.
I think you just ended on such a wonderful note. I was going to ask you if you had words to send us out with, and it sounds like you are trying to send us out with hope to move forward.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a hopeful time. I thought in the presidential debate, instead of talking about and having a category of race and violence in the cities, they should have had a category of how to achieve racial justice in the beloved community right here in the United States of America in our own time. What are the steps that we could actually all come together on, even vis-a-vis compromise on issues of poverty and issues of segregation, issues of criminal justice, all these different issues, right? So I think it's a very hopeful time, but like Malcolm and Martin, it depends on how you frame it, right? So if you frame it as an American carnage in the cities, which hasn't even happened, but the framing stays on people's mind. But if you say, hey, we have an opportunity to build a beloved community, how can we get to work? That leads us in a different direction.
Well, thank you so much. This has been just a fabulous evening, which I knew it was going to be. And all of you, as you saw, you can bookshop.org. You can purchase this book. We can make available on there Dr. Joseph's other books too. I know I'm ready to pick up Stokely Carmichael and know what my dad's getting for Christmas. So invite you all to do that. We showed there some of our upcoming events. We encourage you to register to attend them. I think Eddie Glaude is in November, but you can go to Athenaeum.
That's a beautiful book. That's a beautiful book.
Athenaeum.org to our upcoming events and register to attend that one as well. It is beautiful. He's an incredible writer. My book group this month in October is looking at The Fire Next Time. So we're going to get ready and we'll be able to take into account what we've learned tonight as well. And if you love what you heard tonight and you want to be part of this community and help the Athenaeum also in this, in becoming a community that truly is fully welcoming and inclusive and full dignity for everybody, we invite you to become a member and look forward to seeing all of you at future events. We're so glad you came. And thank you to Dr. Penniel Joseph for his wisdom and sharing so gracefully with us.